Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Yale Center. I'm Kyle Normandin, and I'm the Senior Project Specialist here at the Getty Conservation Institute and project leader of the Conserving Modern Architecture Initiative. Many of you were here in March of last year, and we launched the initiative. We are currently making excellent progress. Over the last year, we have been reaching out to colleagues across the United States, in Europe, here in Los Angeles, to better understand what the real needs of the field are. And so we're delighted to be moving this process forward with a series of public lectures, engaging practitioners in the realm of modern architecture to come and speak with us and work with us to really understand what the field is looking for and how best practice really works. It is my delight this evening to welcome you all. It is important to just emphasize that this initiative is about advancing conservation practice. As you know, this evening's presentation represents the third public lecture in this program. The lecture will focus on the Conservation Management Plan for the Yale Center for British Art by Kahn. It is comprised of a panel of 3 speakers who will present their work on this important and iconic work of modern architecture. So just a few housekeeping rules. We are videotaping this lecture this evening, and we'll make it available online through the portal website. And so we do not allow any photo taking or videotaping during this lecture program. So with that, I would like to introduce Susan McDonald, who is the head of field projects here at the GCI. Susan will introduce our speakers and program in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, who happen to be great friends and colleagues, who, as Kyle said, will present the work to develop a long-term approach to the care and conservation of Yale, the Yale Center for British Art, which is one of the world's great museums and study centres. Designed by American architect Kahn and regarded as one of his great works, it received the 25-year award from the American Institute of Architects in 2005. Peter Inskip is the co-founder of Peter Inskip and Peter Jenkins Architects, a London-based practice who are engaged in conservation and contemporary architectural work and boast an impressive portfolio of work, including many of England's finest sites. Peter oversees all of the work that is undertaken by the firm for the National Trust, which is one of a very important client, as well as major projects where existing and historic buildings are being developed for new uses. He is a current member of the architectural panel of the National Trust and the World Monuments Fund and the building committee for the Paul Mellon Centre for the British Art at Yale. Stephen Gee is a director of Peter Inskip and Peter Jenkins Limited and has an interest in conservation of modern and historic buildings and contemporary architecture as well. And Stephen's work includes the Stowe Garden for the National Trust, and he's been the project architect there since 1990. John Soane's Moggahanger House, Holcombe Hall, Manchester City Art Gallery, the ancient ruins of Falsey and Gray's Court and Battersea Power Station, to name some of their wonderful projects. Inskip and Jenkins' work, I think, really demonstrates how meticulous historic research that can provide a sound understanding of a building's significance, and how this, coupled with analytical and diagnostic work to understand its condition, how the building is deteriorating and why, together inform their approach to conservation. This attention to research and analysis of the information that is revealed characterises their work. The firm is really well known for pushing the boundaries of conservation, something that we also try and achieve here at the GCI. But it's much harder, I think, to do that as an architect working in private practice, where often budget and time can prevail. But the ability to really achieve such standards is dependent, of course, as any of the architects would know, by the commitment and the interest of a client. And so we're very pleased this evening that Constance Clement is joining Peter and Stephen to present this lecture. Constance, or Cece, is the Deputy Director of the Yale Center for British Art and is in fact the client, but as you'll hear when they're talking about their project, has been very involved in the project in a way that I think is somewhat unusual. The project illustrates a highly collaborative approach and process between the building guardian and the architect, who have worked side by side to develop and implement the conservation plan. And they clearly share a passion for the building. Cece was formerly responsible for the Centre's public program and more recently is responsible for the stewardship of the Centre and the implementation of the conservation plan on a day-to-day basis. And we were talking earlier before into what Cece's role is, and it really strikes me that every great building needs a conservation champion within the building to liaise between all the asset managers and the architects and those involved in the work. It must be a great privilege to be able to work in that particular way, and wouldn't it be great if many more of our buildings had someone that was able to do that. I'd also like to acknowledge the Centre's director, Amy Myers, whose vision for the building has brought to fruition in the work that is being undertaken that you'll see tonight. So please join me in welcoming Constance Clement, Peter Inskip and Stephen Gee.
Good evening. Thank you so much for such a kind and generous introduction, Susan. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I also want to thank your wonderful colleagues, Kyle Normandin and Sarah McDonald, who have done so much to make our stay here so rewarding. It's been tremendous. For some time, I've heard my colleagues, Peter Inskip, Peter Inskip and Stephen Gee speak of Susan and her projects at the Getty with great admiration. They and I have been very keen to have her visit the Yale Center for British Art in order to gain her insights into our work there. She has a standing invitation. In the meantime, it's a special privilege and pleasure to have the opportunity to come to California, especially in January, and to learn more about the Getty's important initiative to conserve modern architecture. As many of you know, the Yale Center for British Art is both a public museum and a research institute, and it holds the largest and most comprehensive collection of British art outside the United Kingdom. It's the gift of Paul Mellon, Yale class of 1929, to his university. The collection reflects the development of British art and culture from the Elizabethan period to the present day, and includes major works by Hogarth, Stubbs, Gainsborough, Reynolds, Turner, Blake, and Constable. It's now comprised of 2,000 paintings, 200 sculptures, 50,000 prints and drawings, 35,000 rare books and manuscripts, as well as a reference library and archive. While its great strength is 18th century British art, for which Mr. Mellon had a very special fondness, the collection also includes works as early as a 16th century map documenting Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe, and as recent as an installation piece by Damien Hirst and prints by a number of contemporary British artists. The Yale Center organizes as many as 6 to 8 temporary exhibitions annually. While some are drawn from its own collections, many are international loan exhibitions organized in association with sister institutions both at home and abroad. The center also offers more than 300 programs for the university community, academic audiences, and the general public. These include lectures and symposia, concerts, films, and tours. Our Department of Research and Education oversees both a dedicated group of volunteer docents and a lively student guide program. Like the Getty, the Yale Center also has an active visiting fellowship program which brings a range of individuals, from doctoral candidates to senior scholars of British art and culture, to New Haven to investigate various aspects of the collections. As Susan said, the building was designed by the internationally recognized American architect, Louis Kahn. and it opened to the public 36 years ago this April. Over time, it has been remarkably well maintained and is in excellent condition, thanks to a generous endowment established by its benefactor. That said, the center has undertaken several major refurbishment projects. In 95, 96, nearly all of its windows were in need of replacement since the original seals had failed. A second campaign followed only 2 years later, when ongoing condensation issues and leaks required that the center's roof undergo major repairs. Although a flat roof with 56 skylights might have fared better in Southern California, 20 punishing New England winters had really taken their toll. The museum closed for an entire calendar year, sent part of its permanent collection on tour in Australia, which enabled us to renovate the public galleries as well as the roof. So the original carpet and linen wall coverings were replaced, and the design and layout of the pogo partition walls, which some of you, if you're familiar with the building, will know, and you will see in some of these illustrations, they were rethought. 1998 soon became known as the year of the roof. At this point, I should confess that I am neither an architect nor a conservator. As Susan mentioned earlier, my work initially at the center at the Yale Center for British Art focused on the public dimension of the museum. It was only when Amy Myers was appointed director of the Yale Center in 2002 that, at her invitation, my attention turned to the study of our Kahn building, the building in which I had been fortunate enough to work for a substantial period of time. In fact, my early museum career had given me the wonderful opportunity of experiencing another Kahn building, the one directly across the street, Kahn's first commission that dates to 1953. Needless to say, over time, I'd come to appreciate the special qualities of both buildings, and I was honored to be asked to assist with research on and conservation of the Yale Center for British Art. Amy Myers was especially sensitive to the ways in which the building she remembered so well and revered so much as a graduate student at Yale had changed subtly since her years in New Haven. Yes, the windows had been replaced, the roof repaired, and the galleries refurbished, but it was a discussion about something as minor as the replacement of 2 stainless steel elevator panels that ultimately led her to commission a study of the building. Other details had changed too. Original door handles had been removed and put back upside down. Some had been replaced altogether with inferior handles. State-of-the-art security devices had been installed in prominent locations inside the museum without much thought for placement. New compact metal shelving in our reference library had been embellished with white oak end panels, contrary to a more utilitarian approach that Kahn might have favored. And as new audiovisual equipment had required it, a long and unsightly run of conduit had been added at the base of the magnificent 2-story concrete wall at the front of the center's lecture hall. The list goes on. Only later would my colleagues and I come to understand that these changes over time, some subtle and others more blatant, constitute what conservation architects refer to as architectural drift. Perhaps the most damaging instance of drift had occurred when a regional company had approached a staff member with an offer to refinish one of the stainless steel panels on the exterior of the building. You'll see the middle and bottom panels are the ones that have been treated, shall we say. Presumably this was their effort to demonstrate what their firm could do to improve the appearance of our building. The process they used had stripped the surface of the steel of its very delicate patina and had changed the look of the panel forever. More than a decade later, we are still uncertain exactly how these exterior panels which are such a signature of the center's iconic Kahn building, were produced in the mid-70s, since the firm which manufactured them is no longer in business, and we have not managed to locate the original specs. While recently we have been working with a Connecticut firm in an effort to replicate the finish of the exterior stainless steel on a small scale, the fabrication of the panels remains a mystery, and 2 attic stock panels located in our basement are really quite a precious commodity. Amy Myers was quick to recognize all of these issues, as luck would have it, since in her earlier role as curator of American art at the Huntington in San Marino, she had come to know a British architect who was carrying out research there in conjunction with the conservation of an English country house in Buckinghamshire. The architect was Peter Inskip, and the house was Stowe. In fact, it had been Peter's colleague, Stephen Gee, together with Susan MacDonald, who had brought the practice of conservation plans with them from Australia to the firm of Peter Inskip and Peter Jenkins Architects in London some years earlier. Given her familiarity with the firm's special expertise, Amy hired Peter and Stephen to embark on a study of the Yale Center for British Art. This initiative was among her very first as director. Starting in 2003, Peter and Stephen began to travel to New Haven several times a year to research the history of the design, construction, and renovation of the center, to assess its vulnerabilities, and to develop a conservation plan for it. It was our hope in developing such a plan for an important 20th century building, not only would those of us at Yale become better stewards of Kahn's, one of his last buildings, but also that caretakers of other modernist buildings would be inspired to follow suit. While the Yale Center did not have the benefit of an archive with carefully organized papers, such as the Stowe papers at the Huntington, it did have extensive files of correspondence, meeting minutes, building specifications, and many architectural drawings and plans. Being a relatively young institution, however, the center's papers had never been properly inventoried or cataloged, so considerable work needed to be done, and is still being done, in order to make these searchable. A research assistant was hired to survey the correspondence and to develop finding aids, and Yale undergraduates and graduate students in architecture assisted with the creation of an inventory and the organization of the drawings. In the course of the last decade, no fewer than 20 Yale students have worked in support of this effort, and a number of them have made significant contributions to the project. In addition to focusing attention on these resources in our possession, the center has established a building conservation committee, and that happened in 2003. The committee is comprised of relevant staff as well as representatives from both the Yale School of Architecture and the university's Office of Facilities. We're very fortunate that the committee also includes 2 individuals who have an especially keen understanding of our Kahn building and a long association with it. Professor Jules Prown was the person who recommended Louis Kahn as architect for the center, represented the university as client when it was being designed and constructed, and served as its first director from 1968 to 75. Alexander Purvis studied architecture at Yale when the School of Architecture was housed in Kahn's 1953 art gallery, and he knows both Kahn buildings intimately and speaks very eloquently about them. Others who serve in important advisory roles include Patricia Cummings Loud, curator of architecture and museum archivist at Kahn's Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas, who wrote the book on Kahn's art museums. Abba Tor, the engineer who worked with Kahn on the structural design of the Yale Center. Michael Morris, an objects conservator associated with the Metropolitan Museum of Art and with Cliveden Conservation in the UK, who has analyzed the materials of which the building is comprised and carried out various trials, as well as George Knight, principal of Knight Architecture in New Haven, who since 2009 has been the architect of record for the renovation and rehabilitation projects that we've undertaken, all guided by the conservation plan. The Building Conservation Committee meets several times a year to discuss current projects, and meetings are timed, of course, to coincide with visits from our conservation architects from the UK. It's important to point out that in recent years, the center's collections have continued to grow. 3 new departments have been created, the staff of the museum has doubled, attendance has increased, and a demanding schedule of exhibitions and programs have all impacted the building. Given these developments, in 2005, the Yale Center for British Art commissioned the New York-based firm of Cooper Robertson and Partners to embark on a study of its space needs. In December 2008, Cooper Robertson completed their comprehensive analysis of the physical requirements of the center's programmatic needs over the next 20 years. This document makes recommendations on what can be accommodated in the Kahn building and what could potentially be located at an adjacent site or on the university's newly acquired West Campus, about 10 miles away. It's intended as a companion document to the conservation plan, and together they provide a framework for evaluating the current institution and its future expansion. Before Peter describes his work with Stephen assessing the cultural significance of our Kahn building, where it's most vulnerable, and the process they used to establish policies to guard against future architectural drift, I want to mention briefly the various ways in which the conservation plan informed architectural decisions at the center even before it was published a little over a year ago. For example, early on in our effort to accommodate a fast-growing staff, there was need to renovate a number of small offices, and the principles Peter and Stephen were developing guided our decisions about furnishings and millwork. In one instance, we even replaced a solid wall with a glass partition to provide light into an interior space, since there was a precedent in the identical location on the floor below. A bit later, in 2005, it was decided to move the museum's woodshop to an off-site location in order to create a paintings conservation studio in its place. Ongoing research on the building also informed this project and the choices about materials, lighting, ductwork, and more. To date, the largest undertaking to be guided by the conservation plan was the rehabilitation of the lower court, the exterior courtyard that lies west of the center and below grade, between the museum and the Yale Repertory Theater. Not only had this monumental space become cluttered with unsightly temporary structures, which I think you'll see later, but also the stairs leading down to it had fallen into disrepair and become a liability. A more recent and related project has been the restoration of the lobby area, which leads from that courtyard into the center's lecture hall. That restoration has enabled us to activate an entrance to the building that has never been previously used. The project is not quite complete. Those doors are temporary doors, and the transom above them is also temporary, but we're getting there. I mention these projects now in order to give a sense of the considerable impact the conservation plan has had in the decades since we first undertook it. Over the course of these various projects, both large and small, the number of people who've become familiar with this unique approach to our Kahn building has grown. Not only have those in the university's Office of Facilities become engaged in the process, but the building project team now includes construction managers, structural engineers, masons and electricians, and many others who've come to appreciate the center's significance in new ways and have become sensitive to and respectful of the policies set forth in the conservation plan. While my colleagues on the staff of the center were initially somewhat skeptical of all the time, attention, and expense being devoted to the study of the building, and somewhat impatient with the deliberative process that it has entailed, they have now embraced the conservation plan and take new pride in our efforts to look after the center's landmark building. Certainly, it didn't hurt that along the way, the Yale Center for British Art received, as Susan mentioned, the 2005 25-year award from the American Institute of Architects, and it was the 5th building by Louis Kahn to be so honored. It's really wonderful that colleagues from the Salk, which of course also received that award, are in the audience tonight. This prestigious award, as Susan mentioned, recognizes architectural landmarks of enduring significance completed in the last 25 to 30 years that have withstood this test of time. Only one such award is given annually. This coming summer, the Yale Center will embark on a major refurbishment of 2 of its 3 curatorial departments, both prints and drawings, and rare books and manuscripts. You see prints and drawings on the screen. These contiguous spaces have not been touched since 1977 and are among the few areas that retain their original materials. The project will entail relocating more than 80,000 objects, this explains why we haven't done this before now, in order to enable us to replace worn-out floor and wall coverings with new wool carpet and Belgian linen that closely replicates the original, to renew the millwork and to fabricate and install new storage cases detailed to match the original cases in order to accommodate the fast-growing collections. 2 years hence, in 2015, the center looks forward to refurbishing its public galleries. As I mentioned, they had been done in 1998, but they're in need of further work after lots of wear and tear, and also its lecture hall. Like the curatorial departments, the lecture hall has not been renovated since the center first opened to the public. Each of these projects has benefited from extensive research, great attention to detail, and the marvelous mentoring of our conservation architects who have led us on a journey to understand and respect the remarkable 20th century building, which we are lucky to inhabit and which is admired by so many. It is thanks to their patience, hard work, and able teaching that we hope we have become better caretakers of both the Yale Center for British Art and of the remarkable legacy of Louis Kahn. Thank you.
It's really good working with such clients. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Cece. It's been a great team effort, and the transatlantic team has been fantastic. It's working both sides of the ocean. Throughout, I've worked very closely with my colleague Stephen Gee, and I speak for both of us today. Stephen will be joining us for questions. Kahn buildings have spawned a number of great guardians of their architecture. We have Pat Loud at the Kimball Art Museum, Jackie Thomas at Exeter Library, and of course, C.C. Clement at the Yale Center for British Art. His buildings are in good hands. And it was a joy last year to see Trenton Bath House now repaired and the Four Freedoms Park being completed in New York. With the latter, one might have had doubts about the posthumous realization of an architect's design. But Kahn drew everything to such an extent that the scheme is wholly successful. A conservation plan for any building is based on a very simple concept. A thorough understanding of the place allows an assessment of its cultural significance, the identification where that significance is vulnerable, and the formulation of conservation policies that protect that significance from those vulnerabilities. It's as simple as that. Soane's Moggerhanger of 1812, for which we were deeply grateful for an implementation grant to the Getty, provides an example based on a historic building. The building fabric was thoroughly inspected and recorded. The eating room had been used as a hospital ward for most of the 20th century, and peeling back wallpapers revealed Soane's favourite sunk-reeded dado mouldings still in situ. And a search of the outbuildings discovered not only the columns, but the Ionic capitals and bases taken out to gain a bed space in 1963. The architect's original drawings survived in the Sir John Soane's Museum in London, showing his first intentions for both the form of the room and its decoration. And his building accounts recorded the exact detail of the missing chimney piece for which we had no drawing. Microscopic paint analysis is a hugely important diagnostic and archaeological tool. A sliver of paint layers being taken, set in resin, sawn and polished, so that the microscope could reveal both the decorative history as well as the chronology of change. The information was assembled on a room-by-room basis in a tabulated analysis of fabric, and from this, a conservation plan was drawn up, with the principal policy being the recovery of Soane's design. It meant the removal of late 19th century and 20th century layers, but the underlying scheme by Soane was of such an exceptional personal work by the architect, developed over a period of 30 years, and with so many of his buildings having been lost, such as the great law courts at Westminster and the rebuilding of the Bank of England in the 1920s. In contrast, when we prepared the conservation plan for other houses, like Chastleton, a great manor house that was believed to have been untouched since the 17th century, the policies included the retention of each successive layer, because significance was found to be in the constant way it had been treated in an antiquarian way ever since the 18th century. The crucial thing, therefore, with the conservation plan is the assessment of cultural significance, and from there one can identify those vulnerabilities and establish relevant policies. At Moggahanger, it meant that one of Soane's great rooms was thus recovered, without conjecture and with the maximum retention of original building fabric. The room was fawn, not blue, and must never trust architects' drawings, which is only part of the evidence. The same methodology has been applied by Stephen and me to buildings of the recent past, resulting in conservation plans for Lutyens' great hierarchical bank buildings of the 1930s and Scott's Battersea Power Station, completed only in 1956. Both are now redundant building types, but so important as landmarks and are buildings for which a solution has to be found. The Yale Center is a very significant building, one of the last buildings of Louis Kahn, and perhaps I might say as an outsider, surely the most important American architect of the second half of the 20th century. Quite unlike his preceding works, it turns away from stone and brick masonry and an architectural shadow and gives a tantalizing glimpse of how Kahn's architecture might have developed with its flush steel and glass cladding to a concrete frame had he not collapsed and died at Penn Station on his way back from Dhaka in March 1974. The cultural significance of the centre is enhanced by its association with Paul Mellon and his outstanding collection. Mr. Mellon had collected British paintings from 1936, and they were housed principally in the brick house that he built in Virginia. Mellon gifted his collection to Yale in December '66 and wanted his pictures and books to be seen in a quasi-domestic setting. Because of this, pictures were to be viewed in comparatively small spaces and ever-changing conditions of daylight. The brief for the centre was established by Yale well in advance of choosing the architect and was prepared by a committee working with Jules Prown, who was appointed its first director of the Paul Mellon Centre of British Art, a title that was soon amended by Mr. Mellon to omit his name, as he felt that it was too personal and might deter others from giving to the collection. From the first, it was to be a working department of the university, as well as an art gallery open free of charge to the public. The architects under consideration, of course, included I.M. Pei, who had designed the East Wing of the National Gallery for the Mellon family, and Philip Johnson and Robert Venturi were also amongst those reviewed. However, Kahn's humanistic approach appealed to Jules Prown, and of course Kahn's first art gallery was the University Art Gallery and was well known. Kahn warmed to a fellow bibliophile when he and Prown visited Mr. Mellon at the Brick House, and a visit to California followed in April 1969, where the architect met Paul Mellon and Jules Prown to show them round the Salk Institute. The appointment was formally confirmed in October '69. Kahn's response was very successful. Turner's great painting of the Dort packet boat, becalmed 1818, was the star of the exhibition Paul Mellon's Legacy, A Passion for British Art, held at the Royal Academy in London 6 years ago. But it looked nowhere near as good as it does at the centre, where Kahn's building, his handling of space, light, and views out truly enhanced Turner's great painting. We were appointed to prepare a conservation plan and have been members of the building committee for 10 years. The material that would inform the preparation of the analysis of fabric and the conservation plan process was very similar to that for Moggerhanger, a historic building. The architect's drawings are in the Kahn archive at the University of Pennsylvania, and Bill Whitaker and his staff allowed us the greatest access to all the material in his care. The sketches are fantastic, but the most important items were the general arrangement drawings from which the building was built. These had been adopted by Pelletier and Myers, the architects, when they took over the commission in 1974 to complete the building after Kahn's death. The revisions noted in each title block reveal that Kahn had decided on and his office had detailed virtually every aspect and chronicle a few changes that Pelletier and Myers introduced. Just as I mentioned in relationship to the Four Freedoms Park, it meant that the building as completed was very close to how Kahn had drawn it. Cleaning and conservation trials were carried out with Clifton Conservation of London and Michael Morris from the Metropolitan Museum, and paint and materials analysis showed how the white oak millwork had degraded and how it was originally finished, and the extent that it had been degraded in the sunlight, and this study confirmed that materials were natural. Further analysis showed that the linen lining to the display walls was neither bleached or dyed. That's on the panel at the center of that screen, and confirmed that the decoration of the sheetrock should be pure white in place of a tasteful off-white matching the linen that had crept in the 1990s. Policies were to retain the original fabric wherever possible, and where change was necessary, authenticity of materials and methods of construction should be followed. I'm afraid that too often we find that in America, that preservation means the complete rebuilding of whole elements, especially if they are of the recent past. The conservation policies meant that at the Yale Center, the damaged millwork should not be replaced, but be repaired. However, where worn carpet has to be renewed, herds of sheep have been selected in New Zealand to ensure that the hue of their fleeces is exactly the same that Kahn had selected. The exterior of the centre is essentially of a concrete frame infilled with steel panels. Jules Prown recalls how exacting the architect was in the selection of the finish of the steel on the right-hand side of that slide, and Kahn referred to it as pewter, to ensure that it was, and wanted to ensure that it was absolutely matte and had no reflection. As the architect had never done a steel building, Jules asked Kahn what it would be like, and was told that on a cloudy day, it would look like a moth, and on a sunny day, a butterfly. The problem with the steel is that it appears to have been almost specific to this building, and the manufacturers, as Cece said, are no longer in existence. Steel will be needed for replacements, but attempts at recreating it have so far proved elusive, except for small pieces of sheet. However, 2 unused panels were found in store at the centre, and a parallel to the way we discovered the Ionic columns at Mogahanger, and these could provide the opportunity for the reverse engineering. The quest continues. Abbot-Tor, who had worked as the structural engineer with Kahn, assisted with details on the structure and how the use of the 20-foot grid was, or how different the use of the 20-foot grid was to the diagrid construction that had been used at the Yale University Art Gallery. The structure was also closely integrated with the design of the mechanical systems, with air on the 4th floor being introduced through the V-shaped beams and extracted at low level through an air floor slab. On the lower floors, the input was through steel ducts that boldly extend through every space, galleries, offices, and service areas. What became clear was how consistent Kahn had been in the development of his design, with every space treated with the same intellectual rigor, whether gallery or a rest room. The light fixtures here were also used by Kahn in his own living room in Philadelphia. We worked as a team with Cece and the Building Conservation Committee that she chaired, but also with a succession of students from the Department of the History of Art and the School of Architecture, who enthusiastically worked with us assembling the tabulated analysis of fabric in a similar form to the one that we'd used at Mogahanger. This readily provides all the information on each aspect of the building on a room-by-room basis. Of course, our greatest resource was Professor Prown, seen here on the left. It was his oral history that supplied us with many of Kahn's anecdotes. Not only did he carefully guide the university and the donor to Kahn's doorstep, he also liaised throughout the works with the architect and agreed to the adjustment of the brief as circumstances arose. Although Mellon received progress reports, on the whole, he saw the development of the scheme as something for the university rather than himself. But he visited the construction site on occasion, here in the centre, discussing progress with Prown and Kenneth Freiberg of the Macomber Construction Company, the contractors who had already built SOM's Beinecke Library at Yale. The site for the centre was acquired by the university with funds from Mr. Mellon between 1966 and 68, and it lay outside the area of the city occupied by the university. By 1824, the block on Chapel Street was given over to domestic occupation, and it had been gradually infilled with additional houses during the 19th century. 3 houses were replaced in 1871 by the Calvary Baptist Church, designed by Rufus Russell on the right, and commercial premises had replaced the houses along Chapel Street by the beginning of the 20th century. The clearance of the site involved all the properties on the land acquired by the university, except for the church, which was eventually refurbished for the Yale Repertory Theatre in 1975. The scheme that is known as the first programme was designed by Kahn in accordance with the university's brief, based on very generous space allowances. From the beginning, the section was organised with the principal galleries on the top floor, above further galleries, libraries, and teaching spaces. The arrangement of the ground floor being given over to commercial use responds to a planning requirement that the adoption of the site on Chapel Street should not result in a reduction of rateable property for the city of New Haven. By January 71, Kahn had prepared drawings for presentation to Paul Mellon and was writing that the building had developed to a maturity that I believe in and I hope can be realized. Kahn had wanted the building to extend the full length of the block between High and York Streets, from river to river, as he described it. But before any design was actually made, it was realized that the accommodation in the brief would have resulted in only a 3-story scheme, which was felt to be too insignificant on the site. The centre was therefore stopped just short of the church, with the programme resulting in 4 stories of construction. Kahn felt that leaving the church in place made it look like a dumb animal standing on the corner of York Street. However, he was encouraged when the university asked him to prepare designs for an art library on the site of the church. The developed scheme shown here provides a series of double-height reading rooms, each with a mezzanine gallery, and these were stacked 3 high, either side of a narrow atrium. Sadly, the university's hope that this might also appeal to Mr. Mellon was not met with encouragement, and he suggested that the church site should be landscaped. The art gallery was not to be, and the church was allocated by the university to the Yale rep. In addition, Mr. Mellon also confirmed that he did not wish to increase his princely gift for the centre. The brief, therefore, had to be reduced in 1971 to meet the escalating costs and rampant inflation occurring in the building industry at that time. And Mellon was rather wonderful in that he insisted that it should be treated by the architect as a totally new, fully funded commission. We like that as architects. Kahn responded with an even better building, pulling it away from the church and treating the space in between as an open space. The arrangement of the building was very much carried forward from the first programme, which organised the accommodation around 2 courts with display galleries, mainly those on the east and on the left of this slide, and the libraries and rare book collections to the west. To take advantage of the daylight, the principal galleries still took up the whole of the 4th floor. This organisation was reflected in the exterior of the building. The fenestration responds to the activities behind the elevation, with the windows serving the galleries extending a full story height, while those in reading rooms and offices are adjusted to allow space beneath them for desks and cabinetry. So unusual in Kahn's buildings, where glass was usually suppressed, the glazing was set flush with the elevation, and this caught reflections of the sky, clouds, and the art gallery on the opposite side of the street, not only enlivening the building, but creating a sparkle in the whole of Chapel Street. To welcome visitors, Kahn formed a deep portico across 2 bays at the northeast corner, through which one entered into the light of the tall entrance court beyond. It is a space of transition between the public and institutional realms and has been described as a gesture that linked the university and the city, and it is believed to have arisen from a suggestion put forward by Yale President Brewster. Above the ground floors with its perimeter of commercial units, the interior of the building was organised about its section. The west half of the 2nd and 3rd floors was occupied by 3 departments: the reference library, rare books and manuscripts, and prints and drawings, each associated with a marvellous double-height study room, while the east half provided display galleries for works of art from the collection. The 2nd floor having views out to the street and onto the court to counter museum fatigue and to comply with the all-important aspect of the brief that works should be seen in daylight. The planning of the 20-foot grid gave the galleries the domestic reference that was required in the brief, and for Kahn, a room needed to be 20 feet if paintings were to be viewed within them. And Prown remembers that because of this restriction, there was no art in the architect's own house. It was intended that some space might be used for temporary exhibitions, but this was very limited, and there was no special provision for different lighting conditions. The third floor was given over to works on paper, which formed such a significant part of the collection. Although treated as a dark story, the east side still opened up with one view onto the high street, and displays had to be planned to accommodate this without causing damage to the delicate works on paper. Kahn's unrealized design for wall-mounted cases for the display of drawings was very similar to those that he saw by Paolo Moya in the picture gallery at Christ Church in Oxford. To exploit the conditions of the ever-changing light, the principal galleries for the permanent collection were housed on the top of the building in spaces taller than those on the lower floors, and the whole floor was lit by a grid of shielded skylights, and openings onto the courts allowed distant views through the galleries. It was also organized about two courts. A pair of sketches illustrates alternative schemes for the inner court entrance. Scheme 1, to cover the court with skylight construction on the left. Scheme 2, to expose the court to the sky. As both alternatives were considered external, the elevations were to be metal, in that pewter finish like on the outside of the building, and glass as used on the outside and unprotected. As realized, the entrance court still allows the visitor to look up to the galleries and gives access to the auditorium. But the materials changed from the original proposal, with the steel restricted to the first floor, where it denotes the exclusion of the surrounding commercial premises. Above this, Kahn turned to millwork to indicate the presence of galleries, and openings within these walls invite visitors to explore beyond. The third floor, however, was blind to protect the sensitive works on paper. In contrast to the rest of the building, the skylights are unprotected, and by this, Kahn secured the entrance court as essentially an external space, not suitable for display other than sculpture, and any alteration to that would be intrusive, and conservation policies are agreed accordingly. Temporary exhibitions play a far greater role in the life of the centre than they did 30 years ago, when the emphasis was much more on the permanent collection, but it has been at a cost. The third floor galleries are no longer available for the centre's great collection of works on paper, and openings in the second floor have to be blocked up to meet stringent loan requirements, giving a very blind appearance to the building. Such a problem did not arise when the centre's own collection, because conservation could be addressed through management. When the gallery was given over to solely of the permanent collection for the Paul Mellon centenary year in 2007, one of the joys was that the blinds could be raised and the building used as intended, with views out across the court from gallery to gallery, giving tantalizing glimpses that led visitors on through the second and third floors. The library court is the memory of an external court on which the first program libraries were going to be organized. Kahn's sketch shows it as an exhibition space with paintings hung to its full height, tilted out so that the upper registers could be seen very much as happened in the great room of the Royal Academy exhibitions in the late 18th century. And Kahn had made a big effort to study English country houses and institutions like the Royal Academy. The millwork lining, wood block floor, and the sofa and rug selected by Benjamin Baldwin, who was responsible for furnishings in several Kahn projects. And the tall hang of the pictures secured the library court as a domestic interior, albeit on the lines of a great hall of an English country house. And Kahn acknowledged that that was his source. Just as in the entrance court where the library court gives onto areas concerned with books and works on paper, the millwork is blind, but it opens up to the fourth floor galleries, allowing one to connect through the building. The reduction in the program was directly responsible for the creation of a significant area outside the building, which is in fact an unacknowledged third court. Rather than treating the space between the centre and the church as a plaza that extended the sidewalk, Kahn treated it as an extra court that extended the building at basement level. It repeats and is aligned with the 40-foot square entrance and library courts to its east. The effect is as if a basement story had been built the full length of the site up to the church, and that work had stopped before the superstructure above the western bays had been started, leaving the space abandoned to be adapted as the lower court. The solution meant that Kahn's deceptively simple industrial-like building still incorporated one of his favourite themes, a quiet ruin. Functionally, the court was planned to serve as an alternative entrance to the auditorium, which was given prominence over the commercial units that occupied the other side and had a much larger, taller fenestration. A screen wall concealed the loading dock to the south, and an imperial staircase divided around a viewing platform on the north side as one approached the University Art Gallery on the other side of the road. The erosion of cultural significance had occurred in a serious way as the area had become a no-man's land between centre and church. Understandably, it had been colonized by the commercial restaurant that was accessed from it. Plants in tubs ran counter to the monumentality of Kahn's great flight of steps, and a pergola and trellis erected in the 1990s concealed the glass front to the auditorium lobby on the right, intended as the focus of the court, but then only used as a fire exit. To improve on Kahn, a raking porch with non-structural columns had been erected to clarify the restaurant's entrance. Opening up the court has recovered the auditorium entrance and once again gives meaning to the monumental flight of steps. At the Yale University Art Gallery, Kahn had used screens which he called pogos to display works of art. The panels were held on polecats that extended to the floor and the ceiling and were treated as lightweight screens floating in space, as you see on the left. The richness of the diagrid ceiling allowed the installation of virtually any combination of orthogonal and diagonal arrangements in plan. And in the event, Kahn found this gave too much flexibility, and at the center he restricted this by using a regular 20-foot planning grid, which extended throughout all of the galleries, dividing the carpeted floor with travertine bands. Very difficult to get travertine bands, replacement of the travertine, and one realizes the reason for that when one comes to the Getty. In his design for the pogos, seen for the Yale Center, seen on the right here in a recent mock-up, Kahn developed something much more substantial than those that he had used at the art gallery. The panels were to be set within what Kahn described as an oak beam, which floated above the travertine bands on timber feet, but the head of them was still held by polecats. However, in finishing the building after Kahn's death, the design of the pogos was altered by Pilecki and Myers, possibly at the direction of Edmund Pillsbury, the second director who had succeeded Jules Prown. Pilecki and Myers' pogos sat directly on the floor, and the change lost some of the continuity of space that would have been achieved if the screens had been raised. The effect is lighter than what Kahn had suggested, giving less containment to the room-like volumes that Mr. Mellon had wanted. Over the years, some installations have not followed the intentions to be seen in the architect's original typical layouts. Instances have included screens that are set on the diagonal, in that top picture, and partition walls with doorways cut into them, as in the lower image, ignoring the role of the independent screens disengaged from walls. I hesitate to mention the use of coloured fabric in place of the natural linen. The pogos require replacement periodically as they become fatigued through use, and slight modifications to the edge trim in order to give greater protection to the linen were made in the 1990s when they were last changed. Their replacement now gives the opportunity possibly to return to Kahn's scheme. Seeing art as far as possible in natural daylight was an important part of the brief, and a full-size mock-up was constructed where the effect on the display of pictures from the collection was reviewed by Mellon and Kahn in June 1973. An arrangement of external louvers and internal cassettes to control the light was devised with the lighting designer Richard Kelly, who had worked with the architect at the Kimball. Kahn's design for the cassettes, seen in his drawing on the left, was sculptural, with transparent fins bringing light down into the space. But a value engineering exercise led to the installation of an alternative, seen on the right, which was put forward by the contractor. It handled light just as well and protected the pictures, but was much more bland and less interesting. The policy, if ever a replacement was necessary, might be to realize Kahn's scheme. Lighting throughout the building was also worked on in collaboration with Kelly, and the use of the same fittings gives a consistency of approach throughout the centre. As well as the incandescent light they provide, the fittings themselves also have to be considered as important, and the way they clustered the downlighters reinforces one's movement through the centre. In the galleries, similar fittings provide wall washers and spots, and they are again an important element of the design of the space. The variation in the levels of illumination across the wall surface is also something characteristic of looking at paintings in the building and its quasi-domestic setting. How important the fittings and the varied distribution of light are to the building, and of course to the art, was demonstrated when trials of new fixtures were carried out in response to changing environmental needs. However, the use of miniature downlighters, seen on the right and as developed for the refurbishment of MoMA, confirmed that the scale of the fixtures is crucial in mediating between the scale of other elements, such as the air duct and the overall space. Over the years, there has been in the building what we've termed architectural drift. Additional controls and core points have been added in an ad hoc way to carefully consider arrangements of the fraternity pins as Kahn described them. These are now being rationalized where possible, but of course the damage to the steel panel is a serious problem. In the parking lot, the fencing had decayed and been lost, but some fragments allowed analysis, and with Pilecki and Myers' drawings, reconstruction was possible. It was one of the few elements not designed by Kahn. Changing standards of building codes also need to be responded to. On the main stair seen on the right, the stainless steel handrails designed by Pilecki and Myers as part of the completion works is now considered too large to hold comfortably, and an alternative needs to be sought. In this case, a return to Kahn's original drawings is the first port of call in seeking any solution. In the auditorium on the left, the space has very limited access for people with disabilities, and such visitors have to be led through behind the scenes and sit in effect on the stage. Those more able have to chance their luck to walk down the steps with nothing to hold on to should they fall. Obviously, this needs resolving, but it is something totally new and not an issue addressed by either Kahn or the successive architects. Not every great building is necessarily perfect, and the centre has had its problems. CC has mentioned the need to replace the windows and the roof in the late 1990s, and structural problems were apparent in the stair to the lower court. In construction, the blue stone steps had not been properly anchored into the concrete base, and an inappropriate mortar had been used. Following the guidance of the conservation plan advocating retention of original fabric, the steps and the brick landings were lifted, cleaned, repaired, anchored, and reset. The monumental of this wonderful stair has been recovered, and it again constitutes a major design element of the building, which relates the centre to the entrance to the art gallery across the street. However, the biggest problem facing the centre is the growth of the institution itself. Whether the building could be extended without eroding its cultural significance has to be considered. Today, the centre has a much bigger staff than was ever envisaged when it was opened in 1977, let alone when the revised programme was agreed in 1971. The collection continues to grow, and the institution runs a programme of exhibitions that is far more extensive than previously. One of the casualties of the cuts in 1971 was the requirement for a picture conservation laboratory, and the university thought that this activity could be outsourced. The only facility provided was this very beautiful laboratory for works on paper. 35 years later, the need for a paintings laboratory was acute, especially as the collection has to be housed within the building. The introduction of a laboratory was achieved by relocating the workshop off-site and converting its space. The book and drawing storage had been refitted in 2003, the open shelving, cluster lighting being replaced with rolling stacks and fluorescent tubes. It has altered the space, but the gain justifies the change as long as the space was properly recorded. Similarly, the growth of the collection might also result in an increased picture hang in certain areas of the building. The photograph shows the study gallery that was planned in Kahn's lifetime, and Jules sees this as circumstantial to the needs of the teaching at that time. The hang was dismantled in 1998, but such an approach could be considered as a possibility. Thinking on a larger scale, an extension over the lower court up to the Yale Rep, to the church, would recover the mass on Chapel Street intended by Kahn in his first programme. And it might be seen to be logical in giving the plan using 3 courts stepping across the site. But surely the excavation and modelling of the lower court can also be seen as Kahn making sure that this did not happen, and that the lower court was an intentional barrier to development. Much as the 20-foot grid inside the building was intended to restrict subdivision. His treatment of the building as a finite block denies extension, and if the west elevation was built across, it would have serious impact on the plan, which would result in one of the great double-height reading rooms being marooned in what should be a daylit space. A new building under the parking lot, if carefully designed, could provide additional space with far less impact on the cultural significance of the centre, which would remain virtually unchanged. The space would be readily accessible from the main circulation core of Kahn's building and be reached from the basement lobby that presently only serves the restrooms. Subject to agreement that the standards met were suitable for the display of works of art below ground, the windowless space could be used for temporary exhibitions. Its independence would allow it to be free of the brief that underlies the centre. This would allow Kahn's building to revert to its original pattern of use and would comply with the policy that a major aspect of the significance of this great building lies in the way it facilitates the display of works of art in ever-changing daylight conditions. At present, cultural significance is actually vulnerable from the installation of temporary exhibitions that deny this opportunity. However, we also found that very minor modifications to the galleries would be acceptable, as the 20-foot grid and the presence of the skylight over the whole of the top floor provides potential for considerable flexibility. As just mentioned, reinstalling the study gallery with its dense hang could bring more pictures out on view, and we'd all love that because it recalls the influence of Soane's Museum on the design of art galleries, especially in this country in the 20th century. But the partition wall that formed the study gallery seen here is what Kahn termed circumstantial, and arose directly from a late adjustment of the programme when the design of the centre was being finalised. However, it cannot be seen as sacred, and the resulting division of the south side of the fourth floor into two parallel galleries did not achieve the best exhibition space in the building. It would be perfectly acceptable for it to be changed to a different configuration as long as it respected the parameters set by Kahn. Opening up and integrating the two parallel galleries could give additional display space of the remarkable quality found to the northeast, allowing more paintings to be hung as beautifully as Turner's Dort, as I showed at the beginning, in intimate bays that relate to one another and lead one on to those beyond, celebrating Mr. Mellon's collection so wonderfully and allowing the paintings to be viewed in conditions of ever-varying natural daylight in small-scale spaces as intended. Thank you very much.
Could we have the lights, please? Thank you. So we have time for a few questions, and I would like to invite the speakers, Cece, Stephen, and Peter, to come up, please. And I think we have one microphone here, another microphone here. So, we can start the Q&A. Any questions for the speakers? Well, we could start with, oh, here's one here in the front. Could you speak in the microphone, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Would you kindly elaborate a little bit on the challenges of the steel?
The steel that Kahn made is quite unique in the sense that we don't actually quite know. There was a part of the process that was missed out to achieve that sort of black or pewter colour. We had the metallurgist from Allegheny Ludlam come to the centre and actually try and understand what the process was. But the guys just don't know what step he missed out in the process. So that's why it's going to be very difficult to understand the manufacturing process. The couple of panels which we call the attic stock, we consider those as precious because we hope to, at some time in the future, be able to use those to reverse engineer the process. So the panels are quite unique. He hasn't used those panels in any other building.
And the panels are actually, I mean, if you ever did change the building, the panels are crucial because there's certain areas you could change where you change a gallery into an extended gallery, like I was just showing. And you could change that without altering the windows because that gallery would already have floor-to-ceiling windows. But there are also other places, like there's a series of offices interspersed in the gallery, adjacent to the galleries, which could easily be brought in. But the windows would be the windows belonging to offices because the way the elevation responds and shows you the planning inside the building. And so, you know, I mean, there could be quite a big change there. And one needs to be very careful, and that's one of the metal issue is therefore crucial and not only relates to the metal but to replanning and reuse of some of the areas of the building, as well as where we get damage from impact damage sometimes and graffiti. And
Cece showed the panel, which we affectionately call the Dean panel, because that's the name of the contractor who actually damaged it. And so he actually took away all the matte finish on the metal and actually made it reflective, you know, the complete antithesis of what Kahn was after. So we're working with a conservator from the Met and the object conservator, Michael Morris, but also a metals conservator, Eric Breitung, as we're trying to develop a reversible coating that can go over the sort of first floor panels, to make it sort of matte so it doesn't reflect. And we're just currently undergoing trials using an acrylic paralloid B72 with a flatting agent. And we're doing little test panels around the building on that to see how that's going to last. But also Eric Breitung it's an embryonic phase at the moment where he's going to be trying some thin alumina coating on which they use for silver objects in museums. So we're still trying to sort of balance out reversible coatings that will protect the steel and make it matte. But also there's real problems of de-icing chlorides. So in the winter when they all come out, and they're all thrown over the sidewalk, etc., snow plows actually direct the chlorides back onto the building, so the stainless steel panels are actually corroding. So it's called crevice or pit corrosion. So in all the little crevices, the de-icing salts and chlorides getting in there, and so it's just gradually eating away at the steel. So equally we want to put a reversible coating on that will protect the steel from the chlorides.
We're trying to use
do that.
Fewer chlorides.
Trying to convince
and that's also about the building being in the city. I mean, this idea of it being part of the urban street. It's not as if it's in a university campus and remote or on a hill in California.
Yeah, there's city sidewalks on two sides.
Yeah.
I think we have another question. But could you also state your name, please?
My name is Neil Jackson. One of the great lessons architects learned from Louis Kahn is to do with the separation of servant and served spaces. And this, I think, was very apparent in the first design in the elevation which you showed, Peter, where at the end there appeared to be stair towers separate to and distinct from the main building. In the building as exists now, I would suggest this attitude is still apparent in the ventilation system, in the way that the V channels between the big concrete coffers allows for air to move through the upper stories of the building, and the ventilation system there is distinct and separate to the rest of the building. However, on the lower floors, there are these circular ducts, which, to my mind, confuses this notion. I wonder if you could comment on how rigorous Kahn was in this building in pursuing this notion of servant and served spaces.
Yes, I mean the other one is what he does between the first program and the second program is in the first program he has these service towers on the east and west elevations, and in the reduced program he moves them into to rotated square ducts that rise up and are clad with steel, the external material, and they're internal, rising up either side of the main elevator groups. We thought it was a really interesting building in terms of the integration of services and structure, because of the way the ventilation is actually using the air floors. And that was something that Kahn and Tor were working out together, and seeing the return of that. And the ducts running through the spaces, one might find quite difficult in relationship sometimes to the lighting, but it's quite reassuring seeing them running through and the consistency of them being applied to the whole of the building. One of the problems with the increased staff at the centre is that some office spaces are now much more populated than they're ever designed to be. And in some cases, the ventilation isn't adequate for that. And these great horizontal stainless steel ducts running through obviously cannot be changed, as they're such an important part of the building. We also had it's how he ran electrical services up through the space. And that was, again, very beautifully thought out, very carefully selected positions for electrical socket outlets and things in relationship to skirtings and so forth. But when the place develops, it's been reflected by additional sockets being put in rather an ad hoc way, or with surface-mounted cabling being introduced across the face of concrete walls, like CC was referring to in earlier things. So I think that a study of those services is a really crucial part of the next phase in managing the building.
A question here.
One thing that wasn't completely clear to me was understanding of the observations that you made, which of these have been implemented and which remain recommendations with reference to any of the architectural changes.
Yeah, I think the overall arching policy is that it's such a significant work of architecture by such a different architect that returning the building to its original design, as long as that's a fully worked out one, is a very high priority. And that follows the same as the idea of that sewn house, returning that to its form. Where one would never want to undo, say, the later alterations if there isn't adequate evidence for the things, or for evidence of how long they were in the process. I mean, something like the pogos, going back to Kahn's design, compared with the 1977 one, I think we thought was very possible, because when Stephen analysed the drawings, it was found that that oak beam pogo scheme was appearing on the drawings for a long time through several revisions during Kahn's lifetime. And so he was convinced that that scheme was fine and wasn't just something that someone in the office had knocked up one evening. And the change doesn't come until much, much later with at the behest of a later director who hadn't been involved, like George Brown had been involved in the development of the scheme for so long. So it's studying the evidence, looking how long-standing it is. Why we didn't show very much of the first program schemes and all the wonderful development drawings for that, in that had all been put in the drawer and wasn't really any longer relevant to the conservation policies of the building.
Yeah, question here.
Yes, wonderful talk. Cece had a question on the commercial requirements. Is that still, I assume you can't capture any room at the grade
Sadly,
level?
no. And those commercial spaces are leased by the university. And the big question mark at this point is the restaurant space, which, Paul, you remember having seen around the courtyard. And the university, of course, we've had building works going on in that courtyard, and a restaurant which had been in that space for 24 years vacated, not because of the work, but they decided to wrap up their business, and the university is now seeking another tenant for that space. But it's all, we try to work in tandem with the university. And actually, we were just talking in the car today about trying to make our hopes known for the space and respecting the space when a new tenant comes in, and how to convey that, make sure that the university and we are in partnership as a new tenant is identified, and hopefully finding some.
But some of us slightly disagree. I think the commercial space on the ground floor is very important to Kahn's design. And that's the space going round at street level. And in the early schemes, it actually opened inwards into to a sort of shopping mall in the centre of the building. And then in 73, he turns it so they open out just to the street. And on one of the drawings, Kahn, on an elevation, calls the building the Palazzo Meloni, showing the idea that it's possibly a Roman townhouse with commercial premises on the ground floor and this palace above. What I feel is a problem is and it would be terrible to lose that commercial space and then the wonderful calm of the interior through those courts and the progression up through the building once you've gone into the building. The space that's in the lower court was labelled up as for use as commercial space, but also has this auditorium lobby entrance. So, and that has just been restored. But if ever it could be that space, which is distanced from the street by the great monumental stairs, and it's at the lower level, that could be more appropriate as, say, a museum cafe, or some additional display space. But I can't persuade Yale don't seem very interested in running this cafe yet, is the problem. But so that some of it is integral to it. The others are a sort of borderline case.
We have room, time for one more question.
Returning to the exterior for a moment, aside from the stainless panels, there are very expressive drip moldings. And like many of Kahn's details, they're probably more expressive than they actually are functional. At the edges of those, the water has always managed to channel off. It stained the original windows within only a few years of the construction, and it's still sort of staining the concrete. And I'm wondering if the preservation program has, how the preservation program is addressing that, if at all.
We've been, a lot of the staining is actually coming from the concrete, actually. The free line that's in the concrete is actually washing down over the glass, and it's actually etching the glass in many cases. And also you're getting this sort of a white precipitate forming on all the concrete. We've been looking at, with the conservators, on actually how one might be able to retard that or actually reduce it by some sort of cleaning methods. But a lot of the other studies that we've been doing in parallel with that is that actually we're getting condensation and bimetallic corrosion in the cavity between the insulated steel panels and the metal stud framed walling with the gyprock. So we've been studying that, and part of the next refurbishment phase, which actually requires a sheetrock replacing because it's had so many nails and screws fixing through it, that actually we need to take the sheetrock off, address the bimetallic corrosion, and get the air flowing through those areas. So that's the prime cause for a lot of the external defects. So we need to address the cause of those things first before one can look after the effect. But we have been trying to look at ways of cleaning and reducing the white, but they haven't been very successful yet.
Well, thank you. We're a few minutes over on the program, so we should conclude. A special thanks to our speakers, and we hope you'll all join us for a reception, which is just outside.